I'd like to start by thanking the Feminist Autonomous Center for Research for inviting me to give this keynote. It's really a great pleasure to be part of this initiative. My talk is entitled Everyday Crossings, Palestinian Women Resisting the Settler Colonial Border. And I'll start with a joke. An Israeli arrives at London Heathrow Airport. As he fills out the entry form, the immigration officer asks him, "Occupation?" The Israeli promptly replies, "No, just visiting." Now, this joke was told to me by Marwan on the 18th January 2009, the first day of a very fragile ceasefire after the Israeli attacks on besieged Gaza, which killed more than 1,400 people, wounded many more, and brought the whole population to the brink of a humanitarian catastrophe. The attack was, as you know, one of many. The fact that Marwan sent this message on the first day of a ceasefire demonstrates that the occupied and the colonized always, even after this genocidal attack, as Ilan Pape described it, find ways to survive, laugh, and even tell jokes. It also tells something, I think, about the border, about national and settler colonial bordering practices, and about ways to push back and resist these. Marwan's joke is not only about an Israeli crossing or about to cross the UK national border. Rather, it sheds lights on the wider meanings of such border encounters and crossings. Here, the border is not just a line on the map, but rather a device of control and subjectification. The joke thus opens up wider questions on the politics of state sovereignty and control, and about colonization and subjectification processes at the border. Balibar has convincingly shown that the border is experienced very differently by each one of us. Borders, as Natasha King, drawing on Balibar, states, are physical and imagined, material and experiential. Now, this means that through our different embodied and experiential encounters with the border, we are also defined, categorized, and constituted in very different ways, and with very different consequences for our lives. We are categorized as citizens, refugees, asylum seekers, stateless, irregular or illegals, guests, visitors, or indeed, as the joke pokes fun at, as occupiers or colonizers. The border, thus, is not only a physical but also an epistemological and ontological dividing line. It's not that border practices merely reflect a pre-given order. Rather, the border is performative and constitutive. It creates an order, it creates a hierarchy through its everyday practices. Harsha Walia, in her seminal work on undoing border imperialism, captures this very well when she states that, and I quote, "Interrogating such discursive and embodied borders, their social construction and structures of affect, reveals how we are not just spatially segregated, but also hierarchically stratified. Everywhere that bordering and ordering practices proliferate, they reinforce the enclosure of the commons, thus reifying apartheid relations at the political, economic, social, and psychological levels." Now, this double meaning of the border as a material but also ideational ordering device is also contained in the joke. It is at the encounter of the border that the Israeli is constituted either as a visitor or as an occupier. But then it is also within the representational power of the colonized to turn the established power hierarchies between occupier and occupied upside down. Now it is Marwan, the colonized, who labels and categorizes the occupier, pointing out that occupation and colonization remain an ongoing structural reality in Israel today. This refusal to accept the order that is created through national and settler colonial bordering, to turn it upside down and thus to regain, as the colonized, authorial and representational authority, is, I think, a decolonizing act in itself. In contrast to more public, heroic and overt forms of activism through protests or demonstrations, this form of poking fun at the colonizer is a more covert resistance against material and epistemic borders. Now, it is these kinds of everyday resistance, circumvention, or non-subordination to the settler colonial border regime that I want to focus on in this lecture. Such acts can take physical dimension, when, for example, people sneak through borders, but they can also take various coping strategies at the ideational level, such as, for example, refusing to be labeled, as Marwan does with his joke. In order to trace the functionings of these everyday acts of border refusal, I will look at the case of Palestinian women going on trips. That means Palestinian women crossing Israeli-imposed mobility restrictions to create a sense of normal, joyful life for themselves, their family, and their community. My main argument is that women, with their border crossings, simultaneously challenge Israeli spatial control, but also the settler colonial epistemic project of casting Palestinians, the colonized, as without agency, without joy, dignity, or humanity. Let me start first with some brief background to the context. Settler colonialism, as Patrick Wolf reminds us, is not a one-off event, but rather an ongoing structure whose primary aim is the elimination of the native to secure settler control over the land. As a continuous project of indigenous displacement, dispossession, and removal, the ultimate aim of settler colonialism is to eliminate the native and inhabit the land with a settler population. Israeli settler colonization of Palestine also is ongoing. The US-backed so-called deal of the century is but the latest of a continuous process of Israeli land grab and annexation, which leads to the shrinking, fragmentation, and destruction of Palestinian living spaces. Such Israeli settler colonial policies of spatial control are rooted in the Zionist myth, a land without people for a people without land, and thus they are part and parcel of Israel's long-term project of unilateral separation and Palestinian territorial, social, and political dismemberment. There's no real time here to go into detail of how Israeli colonization has proceeded since and indeed before the 1948 Nakba, the ethnic cleansing, as Ilan Pape terms it, which is the expulsion of more than 750,000 Palestinians from their homes and villages. But let me just illustrate the shrinking and fragmentation of Palestinian lands with this map from the collective Visualizing Palestine. You see here how Palestine is shrinking while Israel is expanding. Early land purchases by Zionist organizations started already under Ottoman rule, but then dramatically accelerated at the wake of the Nakba in 1947, as you see in the second image here. After the Nakba and with the establishment of the Israeli settler colonial state, Palestine was reduced to the West Bank and Gaza. But, as you see, these parts then were further shrunk and further fragmented into isolated enclaves after the 1967 occupation and with the onset of the peace process, leading to the final fragmented image of Palestine in the last image. Settler colonization thus is ongoing. It's a process of conquer and divide implemented through expulsion in 1948, occupation from 1967 onwards, and the so-called peace process, the 1993 Oslo Accords and the subsequent peace agreements, which all ensured and enforced spatial control through different legal and administrative mechanisms, movement restrictions, the apartheid wall, etc. Now, with this context in mind, I want to move to some ethnographic data that I collected during fieldwork in Palestine over the last decade or so. And I want to ask, what does this settler colonial border regime that I've just outlined, what does that mean for everyday life in Palestine? Let me start with Najle, one of my interviewees that I worked with a lot in Palestine. Najle is a single woman in her mid-30s who works as a social worker for women's groups in Ramallah. Every Thursday after her work around 4 p.m., she embarks on the unpredictable journey in a shared taxi from Ramallah back to her home village near Bethlehem. Since Palestinians with a West Bank ID like her cannot travel the direct way from Ramallah to Bethlehem through Jerusalem, which would take around 40 minutes, she takes the often makeshift roads that wind through the craggy valley of Wadi Nar, the valley of fire, And here, depending on traffic and checkpoints, the ride from her home to the work can take up to 4 hours. Now, Najla's trials during her travels between Bethlehem and Ramallah illustrates the splitting up of the West Bank into different enclaves and the real-life impact that has had on Palestinian movement. In the 1993 Oslo Accords, the West Bank was divided into areas A, B, and C, which each of it having different administrative and security arrangements. But Israeli spatial control has also further increased after 2000 through more mobility restrictions, roadblocks, checkpoints, and of course the construction of the illegal apartheid wall. In 2018, the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, identified 705 road closures through permanent and temporary checkpoints, earth mounts, trenches, etc. in the West Bank alone. Most importantly, and not even taking into account the permanent and temporary movement restrictions that I've just outlined, the road system itself is segregated. The map that you can see here illustrates this. While all the roads marked here in the map are accessible to Israelis whose cars have a yellow number plate, Palestinians with a white number plate can only access the white roads fully. They cannot drive on the yellow roads at all, and they have only restricted access to the red roads. As you can see here in the map, red and yellow roads also exist in the West Bank, in the Palestinian territories. This means that Najla, when she's traveling from Bethlehem to Ramallah, needs to go an extra route, needs to go an extra way. While the direct drive through Jerusalem is around 25 kilometers and would take, as I said, around 40 minutes without movement restrictions, the road through Wadi Nar on the white and red roads is around 50 kilometers and is of very bad quality with very dangerous curves on steep cliffs and always has different permanent and temporary checkpoints on the way. Therefore, it can take up to 4 hours. Still, Najla insists on her right to movement. When not traveling back home, Najla uses the weekends to visit friends elsewhere in the West Bank. And there's hardly a weekend that she stays in Ramallah because, as she had explained to me, I quote, "I need to see my friends and enjoy life. I refuse to be locked up here in Ramallah and just spend my life working. I go even if there are checkpoints and it takes long. I need to have a change of scenery." For Najla, therefore, getting from place to place, keeping on moving, is to resist the settler colonial map that wants to confine her life to isolated geographical and social enclaves. Traveling in the West Bank constitutes for Palestinians such as Najla a struggle to regain control over land, life, and living space. That's Najla. Let's move to another woman. I'll call her Amal here. All the names of my interviews I've changed to protect her anonymity. So Amal is a different case. Amal is a mother of 4. She has 2 boys and 2 girls. She's in her 40s and she lives in East Jerusalem, which was occupied by Israel in 1967. Amal likes to enjoy life. With her female friends, she organizes regular trips to different parts in the West Bank, just as Najla. But as she told me one day, when I really want to relax, then I take my book and I go to the Israeli settlements nearby. I was surprised to hear that out of all places she chooses a settlement to enjoy life. Of course, Amal here was not referring to the highly secured illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank, one of which you can see here on this image, and which is entirely impossible for Palestinians to access. They need permits to enter these illegal settlements in the West Bank. No, she was referring to a settlement inside occupied East Jerusalem. You see here in this map the Israeli settlements and Palestinian areas in East Jerusalem. The Palestinian areas in East Jerusalem, they are marked in this map in yellow, and the Israeli settlements, you see them marked in pink. Today there are around 320,000 Palestinians who reside in East Jerusalem, while 212,000 Israeli settlers reside in the settlements which have been constructed and expanded since 1967 in violation of international law. Demolitions of Palestinian houses is ongoing, as the map also indicates. Since 2000, the Israeli authorities have demolished some 1,400 houses and other structures in East Jerusalem. Around 80% of Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem live below the Israeli-defined poverty line, and only around 10% of the city's budget goes to Palestinian neighborhoods. So yes, there is certainly more recreational space in the illegal settlements than in the deprived Palestinian neighborhoods. In this image, you see the Israeli settlement of Pisgat Ze'ev, just next to the much more deprived Palestinian area of Shu'afat. Still, I could not imagine how and why, as a Palestinian, Amal would find it relaxing to go to an Israeli settlement, and I wondered if it would not even be dangerous for her. Amal explained that she would wear sunglasses and a shirt with short sleeves, so that no one can recognize her as a Palestinian. She said, "They think I'm a Jewish woman. I can sit there and read my book and no one bothers me. They have nice gardens and parks there. Where can I go here in East Jerusalem?" Indeed, Amal's movements in annexed and colonized East Jerusalem highlights that the shrinking of Palestine happens not only at the territorial level. Borders are also drawn in the immediate neighborhoods, categorizing people into those entitled to space, home, infrastructure, and a life, and those who are not entitled to that. Nevertheless, and although the Israeli occupation has had very strong damaging effect on her life, Amal has decided to make the best of what there is, even if this means finding ways to gain access to spaces that are formerly denied to her. She refuses to be categorized. She literally changes her appearance and thus her categorization so that she can quietly reappropriate and enjoy the colonized lands. The third case that I want to present to you is that of Karima. Karima, she's a forceful and restless Christian anti-occupation and peace activist in her 60s from Bethlehem. I had known Karima for a while, since the beginning of my field works, but after a couple of months I joined her in 2009 at a Palestinian-Israeli women's meeting in Haifa. Haifa is a seaside town some 150 kilometers away from Bethlehem. Since Haifa is within today's Israel, West Bank Palestinians like Karima cannot go there. But as the Palestinian coordinator for this meeting, Karima had managed to secure travel permits from the Israeli authorities for circa 20 Palestinian women to go from Bethlehem to Haifa for this communications workshop. It was a workshop on communication. Now, very importantly, Karima's family is originally from Haifa. But Haifa's Palestinian population was nearly entirely expelled in 1948 in the Nakba. Karima's family thus became refugees in the West Bank, where they live until today in a refugee camp. There are more than 9 million Palestinian refugees today, spread all over the world, including those who live in the West Bank and Gaza, and also those who are internally displaced within Israel. Their right to return is inalienable, enshrined in international law in the UN General Assembly Resolution 194. Yet most cannot even temporarily visit, let alone return. But some manage, such as Karima, through meetings such as this one, which means enrolling into the colonizers' project, they manage through such projects to secure permits to go and return to their villages and towns of origin. So Karima managed here to secure her return, even if it's just temporary. Now, when I arrived at this communications meeting, there was some trouble between the Israeli instructor and the Palestinian women who had come from Bethlehem. The Israeli instructor was annoyed, as she told me, because, as she said, the Palestinian women came here just to have fun. Well, she was right to an extent. When I met Karima a couple of weeks later in Bethlehem, she explained to me what had happened that day in Haifa. Staying true to her mission of confronting Israelis with reality, she always stressed that we need to confront Israelis with the reality. So staying true to this mission, Karima replied back to the non-present, of course, Israeli instructor, I quote, "Yes, we did come here to enjoy. It is our right as Palestinians to also come here to Haifa to have fun. You stole our land. Remember, Karima's family is originally from Haifa. You stole our land, our water, our rights, and our freedom. So the least we can do is to come here to our land, go to the beach and have fun. There's nothing wrong with that. Or do you really think I want to come here so that you can teach me how to communicate? Karima here thus added yet another layer to how Palestinian women understand their border crossings. She states that it is her right as a Palestinian to access, use, and enjoy those spaces now inside Israel. She is not alone with such an understanding. Most, if not all, Palestinians feel intimately connected to their towns and villages in historic Palestine. The settler colonial border regime has cut off their access to these places and also to the sea. But if there are possibilities to get permit, as you can see here, as happened here in this picture, when many Palestinians returned to the sea when they got permits during the Eid celebrations at the end of Ramadan. So if there are possibilities, such as in that moment, no one will miss the chance to go to the sea. Such de facto return practices, even if just temporary, allow people to revive their own geographies and to return to the sea, which is so important materially and symbolically in their resistance to the settler colonial regime. Now, with these ethnographic vignettes in mind, I would like to now move on to further analyze them and asking, what do these instances of everyday border crossing, what do they mean? How can we read them? The themes that clearly dominate the three women's struggles here are those of space, land, and movement. I have zoomed into three specific cases, the first being the displacement and dispossession of 1948 refugees, the case of Karima, whose family is from Haifa, but her right to return there is denied. The second case is that of the fragmentation of the West Bank in isolated enclaves, where Najla is struggling to maintain her mobility and freedom of movement. And the third case is that of shrinking living spaces in occupied East Jerusalem, where Amal, through disguise, manages to reappropriate and enter the colonizers' illegal settlements. Natasha King, in her monograph No Borders, has termed such acts of border crossing as, I quote, everyday acts of non-subordination and quiet evasions carried out by people who refuse to allow borders to stop them from moving. I think this is a good description of what the women are doing here with their border crossings. They cross and evade physical borders. This is on the one hand the 1967 border between Israel and the West Bank, which you can see here in the infamous 300 Bethlehem checkpoint. The second kinds of borders and restrictions that they cross are the various forms of checkpoints and roadblocks, earth mounds and trenches that stop movement in the West Bank, as you see here. And the third kinds of borders, as you see in this image, are the boundaries between the rich and poor, the colonized and colonizer, that separate Israelis from Palestinians in East Jerusalem, that separate Israeli settlers from Palestinians in East Jerusalem. Women pass through these different physical borders quietly. Their acts are not as spectacular as demonstrations, protests, or vigils that directly, publicly, and visibly confront the border. To the contrary, these acts do not give the border the attention it wants to. They undo what de Genova termed the border spectacle, and instead they quietly proceed to temporarily seize some gains. A trip to Bethlehem, a quiet afternoon in the settlements, or a day at the beach in Haifa. It is evident that with these acts of crossing Israeli-imposed physical restrictions, women do not hope to, cannot, and will not change the material reality of the occupation. But these are nevertheless profoundly political acts, because with their temporary but regular crossings, women quietly but persistently undo the epistemic settler-colonial border. So I would say that it is on this level, the ideational level, that these forms of non-subordination are more long-term. the three women refuse to be subdued to the settler colonial order. They defend their lives and living spaces against fragmentation, and they don't submit to being categorized as powerless, colonized subjects. Settler colonization certainly is concerned, as I hope the maps that I showed illustrated, settler colonization is certainly concerned with controlling land and territory. But the elimination of the native, as Wolf reminds us, goes beyond the expulsion and ethnic cleansing of the indigenous population from the land. It also goes to the very fine grain of native life and subjectivity. Israeli spatial policies, or rather spatiocidal policies, as Sari Hanafi termed them, therefore do not work only at the material level of the land, but also at the ideational level, by colonizing Palestinian cultural spaces and everyday lives. So when Palestinian women defy Israeli-imposed mobility restrictions, and when they struggle to pursue, to the extent that this is possible, a normal life, that means that they are not surrendering to those epistemic bordering practices aimed at native elimination. Rather, they are fighting to maintain their own cultural spaces. So women's acts of traveling to enjoy life, therefore, is really a strategy to resist settler colonial erasure. It is a refusal of the settler colonial bordered map. Women refuse the border as constitutive of their own being and the hierarchies that come with it. They state clearly that they are not illegal trespassers, but rather, as Karima argued, that it is their right as Palestinians to come to Haifa to have fun. Traveling to Haifa, moving around in Jerusalem, or getting from one town to the other in the West Bank is for them a way to remember and practice alternative geographies and mental maps. It's a way to imagine a geography beyond the settler colonial ethno-nationalist border regime. And in this imaginary, Palestinians insist on connectivity, geographical, social, cultural, and political connectivity. And therefore they propose translocal political imaginaries that connect the various localities in Jerusalem, the West Bank, and in fact in all of historic Palestine, to which they feel intimately and affectively connected. Now, I think that it is in these seemingly apolitical acts, the quiet, the non-spectacular circumvention of the border, that Palestinians claim their humanity in a profoundly political act. Let me then here come to the conclusion. Hannah Arendt, in The Origins of Totalitarianism, remarked powerfully that the stateless are not just deprived of their fundamental social, political, and civic rights, but, as she put it, of the right to have rights. Arendt concludes that, I quote, "Man, it turns out, can lose all so-called rights of man without losing his essential quality as man, his human dignity. Only the loss of a polity itself expels him from humanity." Although problematic on other aspects of her work, Arendt's main argument here is important. She reminds us that the nation-state creates statelessness, just as the border creates citizens and others. Her work thus highlights the plight of those left outside the international system based on nation-states, those who by losing their polity are expelled from humanity and become labeled as so-called stateless, refugees, asylum seekers, trespassers, illegals, etc. But then Arendt does not elaborate much on the forms of political agencies that are left for those expelled from humanity. It is here, I think, that Karima's, Amal's, and Najla's insistence on their right to movement and to enjoy life can provide some insights. For them, crossing borders is a way to reclaim their humanity. It's a form of resistance, a refusal to be expelled from humanity and a refusal to accept political dispossession. And as such, it's a constant mental and physical struggle to resist settler colonial subjectification. I started my talk by conceptualizing the border not as a reflection, but as performative and constitutive of hierarchical ordering processes. Women's mental and physical border crossings are also performative acts through which they imagine and in fact de facto enact an order that is very different from the apartheid logic of the settler colonial ethno-nationalist state. Their own political imaginaries center humanity rather than belonging to a state or a polity as fundamentals for political subjecthood. It seems to me that today, in a world where borders are fortified and the living spaces of most are shrinking to enlarge the lives of a few, it is very necessary to recognize and center the political imaginaries proposed by those on the margins, such as Karima, Amal or Najla. As I hope to have shown, this resistance from the margins against ethno-nationalist, settler colonial and other hierarchizing orders happens not only in organized political struggle, but also in the quiet, everyday crossings of those that the border regime wants to, but can never entirely confine. Thank you.